So the Romantic era was part of the early 1800s, and it was a period that valued nature, emotions, beauty, mystery, and a spiritual rather than a churchy sort of concept of God. It was a reaction against the Industrial Revolution, which was making this London dirty and smoggy, and it was also speeding up the pace of life and making it all a little bit more practical rather than focused on the spiritual. And it was also a reaction to the Enlightenment's rationalization of nature. So the Romantics didn't like that the Enlightenment was trying to understand everything. They liked a little bit of mystery, and they felt that it was actually a little bit defiant of God to think you could understand how nature really worked. So the Unitarian religion, the Gothic and medieval tales all influenced Romanticism. The Unitarian religion was quite a radical thing in its day. So religion at the time had their concept of God as having three parts in the Trinity: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. But the Unitarians asserted that God was in fact in everything that he made. So that was meaning that rocks and trees all had God in them, and so did every human being. So that explains why the Romantics were quite so fond of nature, because they saw it as evidence of God's magnificent handiwork and his power. But it also kind of had a side effect of demoting the role of Jesus in the Bible, because Jesus was supposed to be a man but also God. But if everyone has God inside them, it kind of doesn't leave Jesus a very important role. So it caused a lot of conflict. People got kicked out of university over it. Lecturers would fight with students. Fathers would fight with sons. It was actually quite a big deal in its time. So we'll talk a little bit more about the Gothic later, but the Gothic is basically a subgenre or a sub-style that is part of the Romantic. And medieval tales influence the Romantic in terms of stories of knights and castles and the supernatural and those sorts of things. So we'll see more of that as we go along as well. So now let's look at the authors and texts of the Romantic. So, two most important guys probably are Coleridge and Wordsworth. So these are two English poets that were very good friends, and they began the Romantic era with a text called Lyrical Ballads. So this was a collection of poems that the two of them wrote together, and they were folk stories made as poems, or supernatural ones, or celebrations of nature. So it was kind of like the seminal work for the Romantics. On their own, Wordsworth's masterpiece is the Prelude, but of the two poets, Coleridge was kind of considered the better one. And his major works would be the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is incredibly long, but still quite good, and Kubla. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner almost has a bit of a Gothic feel, actually, because even though it's a religious story, it basically takes place with a ghost ship and all that sort of thing coming into it. Another important Romantic is Robert Burns. So he's the national poet of Scotland, which, well, basically Robert Burns is to the Scottish what Shakespeare is to the English. So they love him lots and lots and lots. And they really identify with him as their major literary figure. He's also an early pioneer of the Romantic movement, a little bit separate from Coleridge and Wordsworth. So he wrote Auld Lang Syne, which is the song you might know that's sung at New Year's celebrations. And he also wrote a poem called To a Mouse, which is a brilliant show of empathy for natural creatures and kind of excuses them for being pests. So rather than thinking from the human point of view that, those animals are just there to annoy us, he thinks from the point of view of the mouse that's just trying to, survive and live in its little life. Another important Romantic would be William Blake. He's an English poet and a painter, very famous for the poem The Tiger, which you probably have heard before. The first lines are, "Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night." So very catchy stuff, and he writes a lot about notions of innocence and evil. So very religious themes, but he looks at how they play out in his contemporary life. He was very skeptical of the church for all of his religious input. He was deeply religious and also quite mystical. So he illustrated religious texts, including sections of the Bible and also Dante's work. And he actually believed that he could speak to long-dead biblical prophets as well. So that's either evidence of his great spirituality, or some believe evidence that he was actually a schizophrenic. But either way, he contributed a lot of really unusual work at the time, and you'll probably find his poems quite short and sweet to read. You wouldn't necessarily think of her as a romantic, but that's what Jane Austen is. So she comes in at the very tail end of the Romantic period, and she shows a lot of that stiff upper lip British stuff that tends to come in more in the Victorian era as well. So her novels include Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and Emma. And she's pretty much famous for biting social commentary and the use of irony. So she was the most influential and honoured novelist, sorry. She wrote a lot at the time and was, even though she was a woman, quite respected in her time. It's kind of hard to see her as a romantic, but you have to think about the fact that these young women are always traipsing off on their long English rambles. So the love of the countryside and all that sort of stuff is a bit of echo of that romanticism. So now we're going to go across the Atlantic and think about the Americans and how they were participating in the Romantic. So Edgar Allan Poe has to be at the forefront of this. He is an American poet and short story writer, an essayist, and also one of the leading movements in the American Gothic. So that's what he contributes to. His Gothic tales include murders and issues of the supernatural, and he's best known for the poem The Raven and the story The Telltale Heart. So you've probably heard of both of those before. He was very good because he came up with really unusual rhymes and meters for poetry that were really effective. And his short stories and his poems all make excellent fodder for additional material choices, because most younger students find they actually enjoy reading Poe. Another fellow that we're going to throw in here is Soren Kierkegaard. His work actually becomes a lot more meaningful in the modern and the postmodern periods much, much later, but he was thinking about these things early. So he's the father of existentialism and a central figure in the Danish Golden Age, which was a movement catalysed by Romanticism. So he's again a bit of a religious radical. He argues that reasonable faith, such as in God, requires an element of doubt, or it isn't really faith at all. So you can see how this idea would tie in nicely with all of the issues that the Unitarians were facing.